Hello and welcome to 1 Samuel 27 verses 5 through 12. Before the reading comes up, I just want to pose two questions. You may have asked these questions before about a variety of passages in the Bible. And the first one is, what on earth is this passage doing in the Bible? And the second is, what does this tell us about David's personality? That first question is an important question in regards to 1 Samuel 27 because it's a non-flattering passage about King David. It talks about him being treacherous. It talks about him being cunning. It talks about him being treasonous. And one would wonder, if I was the king, I would find a way in future, after I do become the king, to eliminate this passage from any retelling about my life. But that's not what David did. And we might ask the question, why? So why does it appear in the scriptures? And secondly, why does David want this in here? Because of its reflection upon his own personality. 1 Samuel 27, beginning at verse 5. Then David said to Achish, "If I have found favour in your eyes, let a place be assigned to me in one of the country towns, that I may live there. Why should your servant live in the royal city with you?" So on that day Achish gave him Ziklag, and it has belonged to the kings of Judah ever since. David lived in Philistine territory 1 year and 4 months. Now David and his men went up and raided the Gershurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. From ancient times these people had lived in the land extending to Shur in Egypt. Whenever David attacked an area, he did not leave a man or woman alive, but took sheep and cattle, donkeys and camels and clothes. Then he returned to Achish. When Achish asked, "Where did you go raiding today?" David would say, "Against the Negev of Judah, or against the Negev of Jerahmeel, or against the Negev of the Kenites." He did not leave a man or woman alive to be brought to Gath, for he thought, they might inform on us and say, "This is what David did." And such was his practice, as long as he lived in Philistine territory. Achish trusted David and said to himself, "He has become so obnoxious to his people, the Israelites, that he will be my servant for life." The answer to both those questions, I think, is the same, and that is the reason it's in the scriptures is because it does reflect upon David's personality. Now, 2020 hindsight is a phrase that we use to talk about what we would have done if I knew how it would have turned out, or what we would have done knowing what did occur and how I would have changed what I would have done in the past. And David's life has a number of those examples. And what we find out about King David is that the seeds to his own destruction, the seeds to his own poor decision making, are often seen way back in the past. And this is one such example. The seeds to David's future bad behaviour that we're going to see in a number of chapters in 2 Samuel are traced back to some of the decision making process from his own personality that he actually engaged in right here. And we go, well, what are those decisions? Well, the decision here was to be cunning and clever, whilst he self-justified that decision to himself and maybe even to his own God. A number of behaviour traits that he displays here are behaviour traits which, given opportunity to flourish, always lead to destruction. But what are those behaviour traits? They are self-justification of sin, they are self-justification of bad behaviour, and they are choosing what he would have, I suspect, said in this time of 1 Samuel 27, the less evil of two evils. Let's look at it very quickly as we go through our text. From verse 5, he comes up to Achish and he basically says, "I'm your servant," the same phrase that he used in regards to Saul a number of chapters earlier. And he says, "I found favour in your sight. I am your servant. Help me find a place that I can live." And we might wonder, is David being treasonous? And our answer is yes. But got a hint here of self-justification. It seems like, as we go through our text today, the reason he wanted to move away from Gath, where Achish was the king of, is so that he could behave duplicitous to Israel and to Achish in this other area, this area called Ziklag. It hasn't become evident yet, but it becomes evident as we continue through our text. Verse 6, "So on that day Achish gave him Ziklag, and it's been in Judah's control ever since." And so there's a hint to what happens in the future, isn't it? because we know that David is going to be the future king. And when he becomes the future king, the area that he controlled here will become part of his own realm or dynasty. David lived in the Philistine territory a year and 4 months. That tells you how long, really, that David is waiting to be the king from this time forward. It's going to be a year and 4 months. In other words, Saul's life is probably going to end in the next 16 months of when David will become the king. And so David is this duplicitous, treasonous, treacherous man for the next 16 months until he becomes the king of Israel. And when he does, he's going to be as equally duplicitous and treasonous to Achish at that time that he is to him right now. He's pretending in one sense to be his servant, to be his slave, but in effect he's telling lies to both Saul, to Israel, and to Achish. In other words, he's trying to keep himself alive whilst also not being disrespectful to Achish, nor disrespectful to his own gods. How does he do that? Well, here's the sad reality of how he achieved that delicate, cunning, and duplicitous balance. In verse 8, David and his men went and raided all these people, the Gershurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. Now, the reason that David thought this was probably a novel and good idea is that these were the same groups of people that earlier in Israelite history that they were asked to wipe out, but they decided not to. And so David thinks he may be obeying in part the Lord, but also by obeying this instruction, he hasn't received it from the Lord. By obeying this Old Testament instruction, he at least thinks to himself, at least I'm not disobeying God. At least I'm not going into Israel and obliterating them to earn favour with Achish. I'm certainly not going to be able to go and obliterate the Philistines. So he obliterates the enemies of the Philistines, but without obliterating his own people. He may think, well, that's the best of a bad situation. And he guarantees that situation is able to flourish by killing every single person that he goes and raids, as you can see there in the verses 8 and 9, which allows him that when he comes back to talk to Achish, to tell lies. And the chief lies that he was telling Achish was in order to keep himself safe, which sounds a good idea, but also to keep him safe at the expense of telling the truth, because he did not want to be the man who was both currying favour with the Philistines whilst also invading Israel. Now, on the surface, that seems like a good thing to do. He didn't want to be the person known as hurting his own people. In other words, he put himself into a situation by which his own cunning and cleverness meant he had to exhort to duplicitous behaviour. We have to be careful that we don't place ourselves into a situation that lets us choose the lesser of two evils. The 2020 hindsight would have been, David, don't go to the Philistines. Trust in God. Stay in the wilderness. Trust that God, if he has a plan to get you out in 16 months from the snare of Saul, he can bring that out without having to let you result to sinful and duplicitous behaviour. Choosing the lesser of two evils is still evil. And David sadly will reap a consequence that we'll see for those decisions in 2 Samuel. But he could have known that right away by not going into the heart of the lion's den and having to put his head in the lion's mouth in order to curry the favour of the lion. That was not the right decision to do. And that will be the same for us. Choosing the lesser of two evils is a decision we always have to make once we're in the snare. The best situation for us and for David would have been to get out of the snare before you get into it. Once you're in it, it becomes very hard, doesn't it, to trust God, because it seems like there's no way out unless you make these cunning and clever plans. For David, it was not the right decision, and for us, it will never be the right decision either. Amen.